Good morning, church. My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here, and excited to be able to share the teaching of God's Word this morning. If you've been here over these last weeks, you know that we are going through the book of Ruth. Ruth is one of the most beautiful, wonderful, most beloved stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. Today we're going to be getting to Ruth chapter 3, so if you have your Bible on, I invite you to turn there. It's just 18 short verses. And Ruth is only 4 chapters. It's very brief, but man, is it packed. The narrator is trying to say, and does really say so much in just a little section of Scripture. So we're going to unpack that this morning. Before we read the passage on which the teaching is based, let me bring you up to speed. We found out initially that the story revolved around a man named Elimelech. Elimelech lived in Judah, in Israel. And there was a famine in the land, so Elimelech took his wife Naomi and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they went to Moab, miles and miles to the east, in a different culture, in a different place, with different gods. And what happened along the journey, we're not sure how, but Elimelech dies. And then there's a pivot point in the story, and the story ceases to be about this man named Elimelech, and it begins to be about his wife, Naomi. Now, Naomi, we find out reading it that she's probably too old to remarry, and she's probably not going to have any more sons. And in that place and in that time, to be a widow without any sons was to be destitute, a cultural pariah. And so she has 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And Naomi does something incredibly sacrificial. She says, listen, forget your vows to me, forget your familial obligation. Just let me go back to my people. I don't want to saddle you with the kind of burden of taking care of this old woman. So go back to your mother's homes. Maybe you can remarry. Maybe you can have some sons. Maybe you can have some heirs. Maybe you can have a hope and a future. And there's a lot of tears, and Orpah relents. Orpah goes back to her people, but Ruth stays and says some of the most endearing words in all the Bible. To Naomi, she says, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Something about Naomi's sacrificial love towards her daughters. She was willing to forsake her own future so that they could have one. Something about that so impacted Ruth's heart that she decided that she was going to become an immigrant, a foreigner. She was going to undertake a perilous journey, 2 single women traveling across the ancient Near East, across the Jordan rivers at the height of the floods. In that place and time, there were bears and lions. And so they take this perilous journey. They make their way back to Bethlehem, back to Judah, where Ruth is now an outsider. And it's hanging in the margins, but there's also the threat of violence. It seems like Ruth might endure some kind of persecution because she is not from Israel, she's from Moab. And then last week, we found out that Ruth, because she's just like a spectacular human, has decided that she is going to maintain her aging mother-in-law, Naomi, by gleaning in the fields. This was the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of welfare. Wealthy landowners it was written in the Levitical law that you were not to harvest the edges of your field. You're to leave them unharvested so that the poor could come glean. They would take the heads of grain that were left unharvested. And it was a means by which people who are impoverished could support themselves. And so we see Ruth, and she's gleaning in the fields, and she just happens into a field of a man named Boaz. And then we find out that he has heard rumors, he has heard a story about this woman from Moab who has given so sacrificially to care for her aging mother-in-law. And now she's out here in the field slaving away in order to bring home a little barley for them to eat. And Boaz, his heart is changed. All of a sudden he has deep sympathy for this foreigner and this outsider because she has forsaken her own future in order to care for Naomi. And Boaz takes pity on her, and he gives a command that nobody is to harm her. And he tells Ruth, listen, don't go harvest in any other field. Stay in my field. Here you'll be safe. And then he loads her up with barley, 30 pounds of barley, an ephah of barley. So an incredible amount of food that would have solved all of their, at least their food issues for the foreseeable future. And he sends her home, and Naomi's like, where'd you go? How'd all this happen? And she says, well, I was in the field with this man named Boaz. And then Naomi, if you remember from the story, her name means sweet, Naomi, but she says, call me Mara because I'm bitter. because the Lord has dealt severely with me. She just sees her life as being cursed. She sees her future as being destitute. And all of a sudden, her frown turns upside down, and she's like, Boaz. Because she knows that Boaz is what's called a kinsman redeemer. In ancient Israel, there's a provision in the law that says if your family became impoverished and you lost your land as an extension of that poverty, there is someone in your family, and it was usually the wealthiest patriarch in your clan, could buy back that land, could redeem it. And so she says, oh man, this guy Boaz, he is one of our kinsmen redeemer. And all of a sudden, Naomi's countenance changes. And now we find ourselves at the beginning of chapter 3. Would you please follow along with me? The words will be on the screen. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a young woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her, and he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. This is the word of the Lord. This is the crescendo. This is the apex of the story. This is where it all comes down to. You have 2 women who are kind of broke, busted, and disgusted. One of them is a foreigner and an immigrant who's maintaining her aging mother-in-law. They have no hope. They have no future. But providentially, just so happens that they'd come into the field. She'd come into the field of this man named Boaz, and this man named Boaz had heard about her. This Moabite woman who displayed this incredible, and he says, what? Noble character. There's something about her, one of these intangibles that there's just so much about her. She's an incredible human being. And Boaz is so appreciative, and he admires her. And Ruth, what we have right here, this spreading the edge of your garment over, this is a marriage proposal. So it's a very bold act for her to go to this man at night, and this is tantamount to a proposal. And you see a couple of things happening here. You see the sacrificial courage of Ruth so impacts the heart of Boaz that he ends up taking a woman as his wife who he has no business paying any attention to. And then you see this Middle Eastern patriarch who is probably the most affluent, powerful guy around, using his power in an incredibly gracious way. This is a story about God's covenant faithfulness, and I want to look at it under 3 headings. There's the value of integrity, the destruction of prejudice, and the faithfulness of God. So what I'd like to do this morning, just as a kind of framework, we're going to pull some parts of this narrative out because there's a lot going on here. There's an incredible economy of words. I'm going to pull some facets of this narrative out, and then I'm going to draw some applications for us. And the first is this: the value of integrity. It should be noted that this is the only part in the story where there are only two sets of eyes. You'll see right away that this happens in the dead of night. And so Ruth, Naomi instructs her daughter-in-law. She says, look, this is what you did. You've been working in the field. You stink. Go take a bath. Put on some good clothes. What you're going to do is you're going to go to the threshing floor. The threshing floor is where they would take the barley and they would throw it up in the air, and the wind would blow away the chaff, and what you'd be left with was the heads of grain. And so it was a really laborious task, and chances are Boaz had a bunch of his helpers out there doing it with them, and there was a bit of a celebration when the work had been done, like you see, and then he ends up sleeping, perhaps to guard his harvest against, thieves or something like that. He ends up sleeping with the harvest on the threshing room floor. Naomi says, you're going to go to the threshing room floor, and you're going to lie down at this fellow's feet, and then you're just going to do whatever he says. On the surface, it sounds like terrible advice from your mother-in-law, okay? The tension that we feel when we read these words is the tension that the original hearers heard. There is the vague undertone of tension and intrigue in the air. There's this woman, go put on your best clothes, put on some perfume, get all dolled up, and go to this man and lie at his feet and do whatever he says. The same tension that we feel is the same tension that the original hearers feel. And everybody hearing this story would have been on the edge of their seat with a sense of intrigue. Is there going to be something salacious happening on the barley room, on the threshing room floor? This threshing room floor, is that what the kids are calling it these days, right? And so we're supposed to have that sense. The narrator is being very instructive. And it has been supposed by some people over the years that perhaps Ruth was going there to sexually entrap Boaz. And then maybe Boaz, being a wealthy Middle Eastern patriarch, the kind of person who kind of gets whatever he wants, whenever he wants, maybe he took advantage of the situation. But I tell you why that cannot possibly be the case. In this story, Ruth and Boaz are people of astounding and uncommon character. That's what we're meant to see. The whole story, the golden thread that runs through all of it is this idea of covenant faithfulness. And here we see Ruth and we see Boaz, and we're supposed to see in them our superlatives. They are the very best of us. And so Robert Alter, who's a Jewish commentator, and he's somebody I look to quite often, who really understands Hebrew narrative, this is what he writes about the story of Ruth. He says, it is one of the few truly successful stories in any literature that concentrates almost exclusively on good people. We know that both Ruth and both Boaz had incredible integrity in this moment. Naomi's instructions, again, it's a little delicate. It's a little ambiguous. We're not really sure what she's suggesting here. But we do know that Ruth is the hero of the story, and she has lived with this kind of unimpeachable character up until this point. And so we know that her actions are both bold, but well within the bounds of propriety. And we're supposed to see in Ruth somebody who's extremely resourceful. Sure, that situation could have gone a different way. And then in Boaz, we're supposed to see that even though he is a wealthy Middle Eastern patriarch who's very used to getting his way, that he is every bit the man that we hope he would be. He has behaved with complete propriety, and there you see the theme of this kind of covenant faithfulness that runs through the whole book. And then, if you don't have eyes to see it, or maybe you're not familiar with ancient Near Eastern customs, this whole bit in verse 9 about spread the corner of your garment over me, this is a marriage proposal. This is still practiced in the Near East to this day, and it symbolizes a couple of things. It's saying provide for me and protect me. And it's very interesting that it's a reverse proposal. Ruth is actually proposing to Boaz, and then what is Boaz's response? It's one of it is one of absolute gratitude. It's a little counterintuitive. He says in verse 10, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor." And he says, "Don't be afraid. I will do all you ask." And so here you have these two, and we're meant to be on the edge of our seats. It is dark. There's nobody watching. There's this whole little edge of sexual intrigue. What's going to happen on the threshing floor? And then we see what ends up happening. They're a model of integrity and propriety. And then the story takes the most wonderful twist. Boaz accepts the proposal, and he spreads the edge of his garment over Ruth, and that one act changed the trajectory of her life. It changes the trajectory of Naomi's life. And there is at least one application here. If you were here last week, you know that one of the other big facets, one of the other big themes in the story of Ruth is this idea of loving kindness, the Hebrew word chesed. And this is the place where you see this Hebrew notion of chesed really described through this narrative. And it's love, but it's not just any love. In Hebrew, there are a lot of different words for love. This is loving kindness is how it's usually translated, but this is a sacrificial love. And we're meant to understand this is the kind of love that God has towards us. And we find out that when they display the characters, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, when they all display this chesed, this sacrificial love towards the other, that there is a divine supernatural love that attends it. Last week we called it a horizontal love that is attended also by a vertical love. And the love, as it happens, ends up being synergistic. Like, do you know what synergy is? It is when 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, it equals 12. And so there's this sacrificial love that Naomi has towards Ruth. And Ruth is so touched by the sentiment that, like, don't go with me. You don't want to hitch your wagon to this pony. Go live your life. Go have a future. I'm releasing you of your vows. And Naomi is touched by it. And because of that sacrificial love, she ends up being converted in a sense and ends up, what does she say? "May your gods be my gods, and may the Lord deal ever so severely with me if I break my vow." She takes the covenant name of God. She is converted, in a sense, by Naomi's incredible sacrifice. So there's this vertical love that attends this horizontal love. And then you see Ruth displaying the same kind of loving kindness. She's impoverished herself. She's become an immigrant. She's put herself at the physical risk of danger, and now she's slaving in the fields to maintain this woman. And there is a supernatural vertical love that attends this horizontal love because Boaz sees it. And his heart is somehow impacted. And I kind of imagine it started with, and this is all good love, by the way, it started with a sense of admiration. There was something about this woman. There was a noble character about him that caused him to look up from his work, that caused him to command his servants to protect her, that caused him to provide for her needs. There was something about her nobility that caused a change in his heart. And so that horizontal love was also attended by a vertical love. And then here you see Boaz kind of embodying that again, where he, he's going to marry a racial and cultural outsider. You have a wealthy man, a wealthy Hebrew patriarch. He could, but why would he? There's a loving kindness and there's a supernatural agency that attends it. One of the points that the narrator is making here is just as God attends our horizontal love with vertical love, he attends our horizontal integrity. And there is a supernatural provision that inhabits that integrity. And because this is exactly where the narrative goes, I want to make the point that everybody hearing it, the original hearers would have thought, is there going to be something salacious here? Is there going to be sex? What's going to happen? And everybody would have been wondering. And if you don't think that, you think ancient people, they were just really pious and pure. You haven't read the Old Testament. Oh my goodness. It's like an HBO thing. All right? So everybody would have been wondering, is this where that's going to go? But we find out that they are examples of integrity, and God attends that integrity in an amazing, amazing way. because we find out that there's a marriage proposal and there's an acceptance of that marriage proposal. And then as a result of that marriage, there's a baby. And that baby, if you're here, and I'm tipping my hand, we get there next week, but that baby's name is Obed. And Obed becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David, Israel's greatest king, who's the great-great-grandfather of Jesus. And so there is a supernatural agency that works through this integrity. And God ends up writing a story that none of the people in the story could have possibly conceived. It goes so much better than anybody could have ever imagined. But there's a supernatural agency that attends their integrity. And I bring that up because there is, in this place, in this time, gosh, I grew up in the 80s, and back then, the biblical sexual ethic was considered passé. One man, one woman, in the context of marriage, oh my goodness, how prude. But now, we're in 2025, and holy cow, that was like Girl Scout camp compared to this. And so I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. We live in a time where it's probably the proliferation of a sexual ethic that is counter to what the Bible teaches has never been more rampant. Because pornography is so pervasive, because hookup culture is so pervasive, there's also this new phenomenon where young people aren't getting married, they're just staying single forever and ever. And so I do a lot of weddings, and it's not all that common to have two people who enter into that relationship unscathed. And so I want to let you know this morning that it's never too late to have integrity. It's never too late. John 8:11, there's this fascinating story. And it wasn't in the earliest manuscripts, but they leave it in. They leave it in the NIV. And the story is one of a woman who was caught in adultery, sexual sin. And there are people gathered around to pick up stones to kill this woman because that was the penalty if you were found to be adulterous. I find it very interesting. There's nobody trying to stone any man that she was also adulterous with in the story, and that just goes to show you kind of the uneven hand that women were dealt in that place and in that time. But Jesus shows up, and he says something wonderful, and this is why they leave it in, because it's so consistent with who he was. He says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." And they all go home. All the people who would have stoned this adulterous woman. And then Jesus says to her, and he says, when everybody's gone, he says, "Is there anyone left to condemn you?" And she says, "No." And then he says in John 8:11, he says, "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." The gospel means a great number of things. The good news of Jesus, and it's news. First and foremost, it is news to respond to. Every other religion, every other faith paradigm is a list of instructions to follow. If you do good, if you keep the statutes, then God will bless you and give you a pain-free life and take you to heaven when you'll die. Christianity is the only religion that is not precepts, it is not advice, it is principally news. And it is news to respond to, and at least one outworking of this good news is that Jesus, his blood, his death on the cross, covers your sin. It covers your sin. And what does that mean? It means a great number of things, but it means tomorrow does not have to be the same as today. It means that you can, this very moment, regardless of what your sin proclivity is, and we all got them, let's just be honest about that, you walk through the door with something. There's something that's been nagging you. There's something that the Spirit of God has been convicting you about. And it could be sexual sin. It could be financial sin. It could be the sin of pride, which is this silent, insidious sin that I've never had anyone come to me and say, "Hey, Pastor, I need to confess this to you." No, nobody ever does that one. But you can live a life of integrity from this moment on because Jesus paid for your sins on the cross. Grace and the blood of Christ covers your sin, and that means a number of things, but it means at least this, that tomorrow does not have to be the same as today. You can begin living a life of integrity right now. Also, it means you can heal. It means you can heal. And I want to be careful here because I don't want anyone to make the mistake of saying, well, Pastor said I can just go on sinning and Jesus is going to take care of all that and I'm just going to, carry on with life. And there's not going to be any repercussions or downside or any kind of snare or landmine that you're going to step on that's too big. You can heal. You will have scars. When you sin, it creates a wound in your spirit and in your soul. And because of Jesus, you can heal. But what happens when you heal from a wound? Have you had a wound? My little brother, Chris, I love him, but he stabbed me like 5 times growing up. I've got scars. When you sin, it creates a scar. But you can heal, but you will still have a scar. And in 1 John 2:1, it says this, "My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one." The word advocate is a legal term, and essentially it means lawyer. You have somebody at the right hand of the Father saying, when you put your faith in Jesus, this one is mine. Yeah, he did it again. Yeah, she did it again. But this one is mine. And my blood is going to cover their life. The payment that I tendered on the cross is a payment for their sins. Now, will you agree, church? I want to do a little logical exercise here. That it would be wrong, it would be unfair to punish the same sin twice, right? I got 4 boys. There's a day go by that somebody doesn't sin against the other one. Somebody gets bit, somebody gets punched, something. Somebody ate somebody's cookies. It would be wrong if I punished, as their father, if I punished that same sin twice, right? Like, okay, you got to go to your room, and then tomorrow, guess what? You're going to your room again for that same thing. Unless it was like really bad. There's exceptions. The metaphor breaks down. But anyway, you see what I'm saying? If Jesus paid the penalty for your sin on the cross, it would be unjust of God to punish that sin twice. This means, this whole thing, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one, that when you do sin, you can heal because there is Jesus at the right hand of the Father saying, don't count that against them, put it on my tab. And so God does not, now I don't want you to make a mistake. Don't say, hey, Pastor said it was okay to sin, so woohoo, Sunday afternoon. No. Sin leaves scars. And I know people, I've been a pastor for 20 some odd years, who've lived all sorts of lives before Jesus got a hold of them, and they carry those scars. They carry that baggage into their life, into their relationships, into their marriage. You should strive to have integrity like Ruth and integrity like Boaz, but where you fail, you can heal. That is the value of integrity. Now the destruction of prejudice. This is, well, you'll recognize the sentiment. There are a lot of people out there who think, well, the Bible really, that's just a whole bunch of, that's a regressive moral framework. There's so much in the Bible that's outdated. We don't really want to live like that. In fact, I would say the modern progressive movement sees the Bible, generally speaking, as kind of reinforcing regressive social values. Like here you've got, just the idea of patriarchy. That one's been a buzzword for like the last 3 years. And I get cracked up because really the only place you really see patriarchy in our culture is like places like Ruth. Because here you have an ancient Near Eastern patriarch. He is the most, he's the powerful, affluent, influential man in the story. He is the quintessential patriarch. But I want you to see something. He does not use his position or his power to exploit. He uses it to change the stars of somebody who is marginalized and oppressed. And the Bible subverts so many of these institutions that we see as like culturally regressive. And this is why, by the way, the gospel fundamentally destroys prejudice. God is doing it, and he has weaved it through all the stories in the Hebrew Bible. Because look at Ruth. What do? They end up creating an interracial blended family. in a place where that would have been like just an outlandish idea. In fact, there are a lot of scholars who believe Ruth was written to counter prophets like Nehemiah and Ezra who were advocating against foreign marriages. They're saying, no, we have to be insular, we have to build a wall, we can't be sympathetic to these other cultures. And so there's a lot of people that say Ruth is a polemic against that kind of thinking. Because what they end up doing in the end is creating a non-traditional family through which their greatest king, the one who would unite all of Israel, the one who would write most of the Psalms, King David, would come. And then also you're going to find this, there's this notion in all traditional cultures that somehow men are better than women. We said earlier that unless you had sons, if a woman didn't have sons, she would have been considered cursed in a sense. And then and I'm tipping my hand here, this is next week, but at the very end of the book of Ruth, there is this place where all the women, Naomi is now a doting grandmother. Her stars are absolutely changed. And it is not lost on any of the people that are hanging in the margins how this happened. And they say to her, you are blessed because of Ruth, who is better than 7 sons. Do you know how shocking that would have been to the original hearers? All over the place, God is upending what we would call regressive cultural institutions because his grace automatically diffuses all kinds of prejudice. There's in the Bible and elsewhere in antiquity, there's something, the ironclad law of primogeniture. Has anybody heard of primogeniture? This is where the oldest male in the family will inherit the vast majority of the estate. And what happens in practice is it creates a tremendous disproportionate distribution of wealth. There's a sociologist by the name of Jared Diamond who's wrote about this extensively in his book Collapse, and he attributes the Rwandan genocide to the fact that they were one of the last cultures on earth that still practiced primogeniture. His whole thesis is that it was not as racially motivated as we think it was financially motivated because of this regressive custom where we just arbitrarily choose the oldest son. I want you to see something. God chose to work through Abel, not Cain, Isaac, not Ishmael, Jacob, not Esau, and he ends up working through the youngest of many sons in Joseph and also in David. It's almost like God goes out of his way to choose the second son. And then you can come to the story of Rachel and Leah, and he chooses to work through an unattractive woman, and some of the greatest heroes in the Bible, which was written by the Hebrew people, are non-Hebrews. In Ruth's family line, you have a prostitute by the name of Rahab. You have Ruth, who is from Moab, and one of the greatest heroes in the New Testament is the Good Samaritan. And Samaria was a region adjacent to Israel, and they were half-bloods. They were half-breed Hebrew people, and they were shunned. They were the bitter cultural enemy of the Jews during the first century. Yet that is the story that we will read and think this is the superlative of human nature because look how selfless he was. So almost at every turn, God upends these cultural institutions. He chooses the second son. He chooses the unattractive woman. He chooses to work and bless people who are not ethnically Hebrews. And what does that mean? It means you're saved by grace. It means that God's favor on your life is nothing you can earn or deserve. Rather, it is a gift. The word grace in Hebrew is the word charis, which literally means gift. It is a gift. And if it is a gift, by extension, that has to mean that you shouldn't suppose that anyone else is a better person than you. There's no way that you can be a Christian and look down your nose at anyone else and think that solely because of your relationship with God, you're a better person than them because your pardon has been purchased by his blood. There was nothing about your resume that merited it. He has given you his love. He's put his love on your life, and it is a gift. It is a gift. Now, practically, it has been said, and I don't know if this is true, but through our kind of cultural myopia, it certainly looks like the country, our present Western context is a little more embittered than maybe it's ever been. There are various groups, and they're all looking at each other and saying, it's your fault over there. If you are a Christian who understands the gospel of grace, you cannot look down your nose at anyone else because just because you're a Christian does not necessarily mean that you're a better person. It can't. if you're saved by grace, this does a couple of things. If you are like Naomi and you are bitter, maybe you think life has dealt bitterly with you, it lifts you up. Because it means the King of Heaven looked at you and he saw your scars and he saw your filthy rags and he saw all the stupid decisions you made and he knows your criminal record and he knows your sexual history and he says, I'm putting my love on their life. I love them. So whatever you walked in here this morning with, and if that's you, if maybe you're thinking, well, my name could be Mara too. The King of Heaven loves you, and he gave everything to know you in a personal way. He looks at you, and he says, he advocates for you. He says, this one is mine. This one is mine. But at the same time, if maybe you're proud, and you think, well, thank goodness I'm not like those other people over there. And we all have these little prejudices, and they're around race, and they're around socioeconomics, and they're around religion, and they're around politics. The gospel absolutely destroys prejudice, because what does it mean? You can't possibly be prejudicial towards any person or group if you're saved by grace. It was a gift. You didn't earn it or deserve it. And it humbles you and lifts you up. And I have to, when I started ministry, there was about 25% of the country was Christian, and lately it's gone down to 12. And I see a clear corollary between the amount of animus we have on our national and global stage and the decrease in the people who at least have a base understanding of what the gospel says about grace. But here we are, a small church, right in one of the least church cities in the hemisphere. San Jose, the Bay Area, Portland, and Seattle are kind of statistical anomalies. There's fewer Christians here than there are any place else, but this is one of the most influential places on the planet. And here we are. We've been entrusted with this message that you are far more flawed than you ever thought you were, but you're far more loved than you've ever dreamed. And it's never been more important. And finally, last point, this narrative, this passage specifically, this chapter of Ruth shows us the faithfulness of God. The symbolism in here of this spreading the edge of your garment over me, this is a marriage. This is a marriage proposal, and when you look in the Bible, you're going to see marriage used and spoken about in a number of different ways. And I do a lot of weddings. I just got a phone call that one of the girls who's in my youth group like 15 years ago wants me to do her wedding, and I'm just tickled about it. I think it's the greatest thing ever. And whenever we do a wedding, I'm always going to quote Genesis chapter 2. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus quotes this passage in Matthew and Mark. Paul quotes it in Ephesians. This is the picture of marriage that we're given in the Bible, and it's this incredible, mysterious, supernatural mingling of souls that happens. People can't explain it, but if you've ever been married, you know what I'm talking about. Married people even end up looking like each other after a long time. Have you seen your grandparents? They didn't start like that. But there is something supernatural that happens, and this is some of the imagery we're given so that we'll understand God's love. At the Last Supper, Jesus is celebrating the Passover Seder, and he is with his disciples, and it's the last time he's going to eat with them. And in just a moment, we're going to remember that event through Holy Communion, the Lord's table. And there, if you've ever been to a Seder, you know that there are a lot of elements. There are bitter herbs. There is salt water to remind them of the tears they shed. There is unleavened bread to remind them of how they needed to bake without yeast because they were being pursued. There are all these elements. And there are also 4 glasses of wine to symbolize all of God's promises to his people. And so it's a dinner, but it's a dinner that has all this tradition and meaning woven into it. When Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciples, he does something that was never, ever done at a Passover Seder. Do you know what he did? He took the cup, he blessed it, and he said, "Take this, all of you, and drink. This is the cup of my blood." Do you know at a Passover Seder there is no passing of cups? There is, however, one ceremony where there is a passing of cups, and that's a wedding. And Jesus, through the Lord's Supper, through that Passover, that Last Supper, he's saying, he is proposing. He is saying, spread the edge of your garment over me. And what is a marriage proposal? Do you take this person to have and to hold, to love and to cherish through sickness and health, and richer and poorer until death do you part? That's what he's saying. And the reason I bring this up is because, much to my intrigue and delight, Jesus has become kind of fashionable again. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, you were considered kind of like an unlearned simpleton if you were a religious person. But somehow, some way, all of a sudden, Jesus has become popular. He has fans. I'm actually pretty excited about it because it's interesting. It's a conversation that hasn't happened in a long time in the general discourse. But you've got celebrities like Joe Rogan, who has the #1 podcast in the world, all of a sudden becoming pretty sympathetic to Christian claims. And just recently, he's had a couple of famous Christian apologists on his podcast, and you can begin to see old Joe starting to soften up a little bit. And then you've got celebrities like Bear Grylls and Russell Brand who have kind of gone public with their Christian faith. Russell Brand got baptized, I think, in the Jordan by Bear Grylls, if I'm not mistaken. And now he is very forward about his faith. And then you've got public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson who are doing, he just published a 12-part series on the gospel that you can watch on the Daily Wire. And I'm not going to recommend it because he kind of got it wrong. But here's my point. God wants faithful, not fans. There's no way that it's logically inconsistent. It's logically incoherent to be a fan of Jesus. And by the way, this is Peterson's motif. He says, look at the Sermon on the Mount. Look at the Gospels. Isn't he a moral example? Look at the integrity of his teaching. And he's got a whole panel of people like, yes, lots of integrity in the teaching. And he misses the point entirely. Because Jesus cannot, he is a moral example, but he's not less than a moral example. But oh my, he is far more than that. Have you read the Sermon on the Mount? If Jesus is just a moral example, then the information contained in the gospel is a crushing moral ethic. He says, what does he say? He says, you have heard it said, do not murder. But I tell you, if you have said raka to your brother, which is an Aramaic term for contempt, you have murdered him in your heart. Most Sundays, I murder some people on the way here. He also says, if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. And the whole point of it is, there is no way that you're going to keep God's commands as a kind of to-do list in order to get him to bless you. There's no way that you're going to balance the scales of justice. And if it's simply a kind of moral attainment, it will crush you. What it's supposed to do is show you that you need a redeemer. You need the Redeemer. And this is the symbol you see all through Ruth. And this provision, this marriage, is a symbol of God's covenant faithfulness. And if I'm to draw any application for us this morning, it's that Jesus does not want you to flirt with him. Jesus does not want to date you. Jesus does not want a tryst. Jesus wants a wedding. And just like I still remember when I proposed to my wife, and it's that you let him spread the edge of his garment over you. Will you walk with me? Will you be with me through all of it, thick and thin? Will you love me the rest of your life? Because he's willing to love you the rest of your life and into eternity. He's not interested in fans. It's logically inconsistent. If he cannot be just a good moral teacher. He claimed to be the Son of God. So either he's telling the truth, he is who he said he was, or he's a liar. The conclusion that some of these folks are drawing is the one conclusion you can't logically draw. And he is not interested in fans. He wants your faithfulness. Now, a couple of applications as we close. I wish I could remember the name of the Bible teacher who gave the metaphor, and I looked for it, but here's what they said, and it was meaningful, and so I'm going to relate it. I'm going to do it in the first person because it has to work that way. There was a seminarian, and he was listening to his professor, and she said, if I knock on your door, you cannot say, come in, Jeff, but stay out, Shock. You just can't do it. It wouldn't make any sense. It's logically incoherent. You can't have Jesus as a moral example. You can't have like Jesus as your friend. Remember those Jesus is my homeboy shirts? Like I kind of like the sentiment, but there's a problem with it. You have to have him as your king. You have to, like, the symbol he gives us with the Last Supper is a marriage. You have to be marriage, and there's covenant faithfulness. He's going to be faithful to you, and to the best of your earthly ability, you're going to be faithful to him. And I want to point out one permutation of that faithfulness is this. Do you love his people? Do you love the church? One of the other interesting phenomenon of recent years is that there are a lot of people who, they like Jesus, but not the church. There's a couple of books with that title. Jesus, in Ephesians 5, he instructs husbands. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and laid his life down for her. That's the standard for earthly husbands, by the way, if you're out there and you're wondering, these wives are going to be like, see that? You know? But that is how much he loves his church. Now, church, imperfect organism. All right, I'm putting my cards on the table. You got a bunch of sinners being led by more sinners with sinners as elders. There's going to be some hiccups. This bride has blemishes. But it is the bride of Christ, and he loves his church. And so are you conforming yourself to the image of Jesus? Do you love his people? Do you love his church? Are you investing in Christian community? Are you serving your local church? And one other application. You can't have a relationship with Jesus where you're a fair weather fan. Because life is hard. And if you're over the age of about 29, you're starting to notice the second law of thermodynamics applies to your knees. And everything everywhere is breaking down. And you will not be able to weather the storm unless you accept his marriage proposal. Life has hardship, and all of us, one day, there is a trap door under every single one of us that is going to open, and the only thing on the other side is the arms of Jesus. And unless you have this covenant relationship with him, unless you have gone from fan to faithful, unless you have, call him Lord, unless you have made him the king of your life, then I fear that you may not have the resources you need to weather life's storms. There is perhaps one of my favorite examples of this, and it's relevant now because of the fires happening in Los Angeles. In 1817, there was a massive fire, and it destroyed all of Chicago. And in Chicago, there lived a wealthy lawyer by the name of Horatio Spafford, and he owned a bunch of real estate in Chicago, and it was destroyed. So he was financially ruined by this fire. And he was depressed, and he decided, he was a Christian guy. He said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take my whole family to England for the summer. And they were going to work, and Dwight Moody was doing a kind of evangelistic campaign in England. And he was going to take his whole family over there so they could perhaps heal a little bit, and they were going to invest in Christian ministry. And he had some business to attend to, so he sent his wife Anne, his daughter Annie, his other daughter Maggie, his other daughter Bessie, and his daughter Tanetta ahead on a freighter. And in the mid-Atlantic, that freighter somehow crashed into another freighter, and it sank. And then Annie Spafford sent a famous telegram to Horatio back in Chicago. He had heard about the shipwreck, and she sent a famous telegram. It was 2 words, and it was saved alone. And so Horatio Spafford's overcome by grief. And he boards a freighter, and he skates the ocean, and history records that along his voyage, when he had gotten to roughly the same spot where his wife and daughter's ship sank and his daughters perished, he composed a song. Somehow, in the depths of his despair, a song rose in his heart, and it goes like this. When peace like a river attends my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, you have taught me to know. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and has shed his own blood for my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It's hard to conceive of how this could well up from your heart in the face of such tragedy. But here, and maybe for the first time in his life, he has glimpsed the beauty of the cross. That he has a king who loved him so much that he offered him nothing short of a marriage proposal. And what does Paul say in Romans? Not height, nor depths, nor angels, nor demons, nor life, nor death. Nothing will separate you from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. And that is my prayer for you. That you would put him on the throne of your life, that you would crown him king of all, and that you would have a hope and a peace that passes all understanding. This concludes the teaching of God's word.